the science that underpins PBS and just some of its applications, because there are quite a few, and specifically the science that gave rise to the assessment and intervention procedures that we use. So I'll talk about that first, and then I'll go on to some of the applications. So the science I'm referring to, of course, is behavior analysis, the scientific study of how we learn, why it is that we do the things we do, why we behave, in other words. And 80 plus years of research has greatly advanced our understanding of human behavior. And I think one of the biggest contributions of behavior analysis has been to demonstrate the extent to which behavior is influenced, determined by the environment. So it really does make sense to think of behavior as an interaction between the person and what's going on around them, their environment. So, and that can be the social environment, that obviously plays a huge part, but it can be activity related, it can be to do with the physical environment, and indeed in a behavioral conceptualization, it can be their biology and certain private events as well. So if behavior is influenced by, determined by the environment, then it makes sense that to understand behavior, we have to understand the environment or the context in which it occurs. And the good thing is we've got a helpful model for breaking down the different types of environmental factors that can influence behavior. So many of you will be familiar with this model, except it usually has antecedent behavior consequence on it. And I thought, where my last talk had lots of technical terms in, I'm going to put some user-friendly terms in this one. So antecedents really consist of factors that motivate, factors that act as cues. So motivators, they're very much about, they determine how much you want something, and the cues, they're how available that thing might be. They happen before behavior, but actually some motivating operations can be occurring whilst still be present while behavior is occurring, like not feeling well, for example. And then our results, which in the traditional model are our consequences, of course. This is what the behavior enables you to get, or what it is that it maybe helps you avoid. Okay? And I think what always strikes me whenever when I was first reading about all of this stuff many years ago, whenever I speak about it, is that it's like any model. When you look at it, on a screen, it all looks so neat, but it's not in real life. These factors are impacting on us all the time. Okay, so all of you listening to me now, there are lots of other things you could be doing. Of course, you don't want to do those other things, but there are lots of opportunities available to you in any given moment. There are lots of forces acting upon our behavior. So over time, we learn what enables us to get our needs met as on the previous slide, it's very much based on context and environment. So if a behavior gets us something pleasant or makes something unpleasant go away, then it's more likely to become part of our repertoire. Specifically, it's more likely to be presented again. We're more likely to display it in that same context. So again, that point about have to understand the context in order to understand the behavior. So I should have warned you that was coming, because you've probably taken you by surprise as much as it did me. This is the first of our CPD words, CEU words. So I'll leave that up there just for a few seconds to give people a chance to write it down. Okay, so I think I said I'd be brief on the science, and that was it. So any questions, do put them in the Q&A. So I'll move now to some of the applications, and I very quickly just put this list together. I'm sure people could add to this. I'm pretty sure I haven't covered everything there. I've started with the two client groups contexts that I guess are most associated with the underpinning science behavior analysis. So people with a learning disability. I put here challenging behavior, but also skills teaching and autism as well. But it's also been used with older adults, people with acquired brain injury, typically developing children, with gambling and addiction, and in OBM, organizational behavior management. So using the science to help employees to be happier, more productive, and help organizations achieve their goals. So lots of applications. Sports psychology is another one. Always forget that. So what I'm going to do rather arbitrarily is focus on these three. It's not arbitrary. I have a particular interest here, and I've been doing a fair bit of work lately with typically developing children. So that's become quite an interest of mine. And I'll run through some example interventions in each of those areas where the science of behavior analysis has been put into practice. So it's worth just saying that the goal is really always the same. It's to improve quality of life in some way. So that's the socially important dimension of applied behavior analysis, and we do that by teaching people skills. You know, this all comes from learning theory. That's the key intervention in behavior analysis, because at times we might just be teaching skills to the people around our actual client, but some kind of teaching is always part of it. Hopefully what we're doing is teaching our clients as well. So in a very constructive way, adding to people's repertoires to give them the skills they need to get the life they want. So older adults, I'll start with older adults. And ABA behavior analysis has been used to do quite a few things. It's been used to address challenging behavior, and also to reduce the impact of the cognitive decline that sometimes comes with aging. So there was a really interesting study I was reading that involved enhancing conversation skills in patients with Alzheimer's using a memory aid, so scripts, you know, topics to talk about. But the one I'll be speaking with you about, it's a piece of work a colleague of mine did, actually, which she ended up publishing. And as I've said that, I've realized I forgot to include the reference. So if anyone needs it, I'll send that to, if anyone wants it, I'll send it to Hannah. So the setting was a care home for people with dementia. And the goal, there were two goals: to improve communication between the people living there, and to increase levels of engagement in an activity that mattered to people. And the strategy was to change the physical environment. So you remember earlier I talked about environment and the impact on behavior and the different types of environmental change. So this looked at the physical environment, which is why it interested me. So and it was specifically, it was looking at the layout of the communal lounge. And the lead on this, my colleague, she said that there was if anyone's ever visited a home for older adults, what you'll often find is layout number one. So the chairs around the edge. It certainly was the case when I used to visit my late grandmother. You know, so you've got sort of lots of chairs around the edge and this big space in the middle. So what the researchers did was play around with two different layouts. The second one was aimed at increasing engagement in activity. So what they did, they made use of the space, and they had a bunch of different tables that related to different activities. So there was one coffee table and a sofa that faced the TV, just for people who wanted to watch TV. There were chairs around tables that had puzzles on, magazines, dominoes, chess, all different, no, not chess, dominoes, different activities. And then the small groups layout, that was the one that was aimed at increasing conversation between people. And that was, it still made use of the space in the same way. So you had chairs facing each other around the tables. But in layouts number 1 and 3, the activities, so dominoes, magazines, and so on, they were just sort of wherever they would be. There was no sort of specific positioning of those. So the television was on in all these conditions, and between 0 and 6 members of staff were present in the lounge throughout the 3 sessions. So what were the results? Well, you've probably guessed where this is going. So engagement was 10 times higher, roughly, in the activity specific versus the chairs around the edge layout. And communication was higher in that layout as well versus chairs around the edge. And in the communication layout, small groups arrangement, communication was 10 times higher in that group versus the chairs around the edge. So I wanted to share this with you because there's quite a literature in behavior analysis on older adults. Behavioral gerontology is called, and I could have presented some more technical interventions, but I love this one because it's very low cost, and as many of you in the audience will know, it's often the challenge is getting strategies implemented. This one, it didn't require any training. It's literally changing the layout of a room, but it enriched people's lives. So that's my first example. So acquired brain injury, as the name suggests, someone is typically developing or can be typically developing, and then they have an accident, in the case of traumatic brain injury, some kind of impact, or their heart stops, there's no oxygen to the brain, and they have a stroke or something like that. So the intervention that I wanted to talk with you about here, it was a really nice mix of different professionals, well, one professional actually, but using their neuropsychological knowledge and also some behavioral knowledge. And so this was implemented by a clinical psychologist, and I've changed all of the details. It's actually my partner. She implemented this. She works in neuro rehab, and there was a patient who had had a stroke. It had left him with some physical problems, mobility related. He could still walk. It was just difficult for him, and also some cognitive problems. So, and what was happening, because of the combination, he was being hoisted from one place to another. So for anyone who's not familiar, it's a mechanical device that literally picks you up, and for this gentleman, it was picking him up from a wheelchair to bed, bed to wheelchair, and then wheelchair to shower, for example. And it's anyone who's been hoisted will report that it is not a pleasant experience. In fact, people hate it. They find it really, really scary. It was an impact. It's obviously an impact on quality of life in terms of his independence. It's unpleasant, and he couldn't go out with his family because there's no such thing as a portable hoist. So he had some use of his legs, as I said, but the sequencing problems made it difficult for him to carry out the steps involved in, no pun intended, in a transfer. So he although he was physically able to slide to the edge of the chair, stand up, move, and so on, the sequencing difficulties he experienced made that difficult. Now, what the first strategy that sprang to everyone's mind was, well, let's just prompt him through the steps. But this is where it gets interesting, because he as well as having sequencing problems, he was also distractible. So staff were prompting him, and then what would happen is he'd turn and look at the staff member who was prompting him and focus on them and not actually go through the steps. So what my partner did, she used a strategy called self-instruction, which is a type of self-management strategy where you generate your own prompts and then you follow it. So we do this if we've got a few different cards and we're going to the card machine and we start, saying the number in our head. It's a bit like that. So first of all, she did a task analysis. What are all the steps involved in actually getting up from a chair if you have a mobility problem? So you have to slide to the end, you have to put your heels down. There are a bunch of steps involved in this. And then they practiced it with him, but in a very specific way. They practiced getting him to say the prompt and then follow his own prompt. And that was, and this is where the multidisciplinary part comes in. Neuropsychological testing showed that he had an intact memory function with regard to auditory information. So he couldn't follow a visual prompt as well, but he could, if he spoke the words, actually follow it. So they taught him this. I think it took a couple of days of mass trials to until he was fluent, but within 2 days, he wasn't using the hoist anymore. So massive impact on quality of life, independence came back, and he could go out with his family. Yeah. Okay, how am I for time, Hannah? I've not been keeping track.
No, you've got another 13 minutes.
Good, okay. So the final area of application is typically developing children. And so the context for this is that I've been working for a few years now with a local authority that has upskilled a team of practitioners who work with children and young people who can engage in some forms of challenging behavior. They don't have a learning disability. So I've provided the team with a lot of training on ABA, PBS approaches, and now they get ongoing supervision from me. So I've put on the slide here some of the behaviors that we're seeing, and the idea is, I guess it's a kind of early intervention model. They're not that young, but the idea is that if these young people get input now, it might mean they don't require lots of services when they're older, and they can learn some skills that will hold them in good stead. And here are an example of some of the diagnoses that are coming through, none of which I'm an expert in, by the way. So we do make sure that the relevant professionals are involved in doing what they need to do. So what best practice says is the best approach. So what was interesting early on, and this is why I picked this one, because if any of you are working in these areas or thinking of doing it, this might save you a bit of time, or you might actually have a different take on it. So the early on, the team actually that I was supervising reported back that some of the existing tools that are out there to aid functional behavior assessment, so questionnaires, weren't as applicable to typically developing kids, particularly when you are interviewing the young person themselves. Okay, bear in mind they have no learning disability. So I did a bit of a search. I found on the PBIS website, so that's Positive Behavioural Interventions and Supports, I wrote that down. They have a questionnaire for typically developing kids, but it's very much focused on a school context. So in the end, I developed one myself, which I hasten to add, I'm not presenting this as something that's had its psychometric properties tested or has been standardized or anything like that. It's just an aid for gathering that information, okay? And based it heavily on one of my all-time favorite questionnaires, Gold Diamond's constructional questionnaire. Highly recommend you read this paper. It's from years back, and it would take you about 2 weeks to read, but it's excellent. And also the functional assessment interview, which many of you will know. And to give you an idea of the types of questions that we're now finding really useful, that the kids are responding well to. There's a real emphasis on what the young person's goals are. Okay, so behavior support works best when it removes barriers to someone achieving their goals. For them, then it becomes hugely motivating. So there's quite a lot of an emphasis on that. And also, because some of the strategies are, because these are not people with a learning disability, it's a lot easier to use self-management strategies. Not that you can't with people with a learning disability, but it tends to, we're finding that a lot of kids, that's working quite well for them. So some of the questions are very much geared up to helping the young person identify their own precursors. It's a really useful starting point for awareness training, so becoming aware of the fact that they're about to engage in the behavior of concern and doing something instead. Okay, it's a bit like the steps of a habit reversal, but not quite. Okay. So I'm conscious of the time. I think I might just give one example and then stop. I had three quick case study examples, but I'll share this one with you. So Anthony is 14, has a diagnosis of oppositional defiant disorder, engaging in quite risky physical aggression. He'd pick up heavy things and hit people with them. And after running through some of the questions, including the precursor questions there, he identified raising his own voice as a precursor, which is a really nice observable behavior. And the strategy that him and my supervisee came up with was a really simple one. He'd leave the room, because it was always, it involved other people, and take deep breaths, diaphragmatic breathing. The kids seem to love this. Walk up and down, take deep breaths, but whilst moving around somewhere. That seems to work for him. So it's an incompatible behavior. You can't be hitting people if he's not in the same room. And when he was ready to re-engage, he would WhatsApp his parents. They had this agreement that they would come back and repair things after exchanging WhatsApp. So they practiced this using the behavior skills training approach. Okay, so instruction, my supervisee modeled being Anthony and doing the strategies. Anthony practiced it. That's the rehearsal component, and then there's some feedback. And this was one of those real sort of dream interventions where it just worked from day one. They're not all like that, but it worked from day one. And if his family, if it worked from day one, but there was a little bit of prompting initially, because if the family saw he was raising his voice, heard he was raising his voice without using a strategy, they'd agreed between them on a phrase, so that they would say to him, loud voice, Anthony, remember your strategy. He asked them to say that. But after about a week, he'd acquired this behavior himself. So I have a few more examples, but I think I better stop there and open this up to questions.